Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Well, there's yet another Artemis conspiracy that's brewed up, this time surrounding the re-entry to Earth, with numerous posts talking about several aspects like the speed and the temperatures involved. But let's debunk these in chronological order that they occurred during re-entry. So, Artemis was approaching Earth, having been coasting back from the moon, and the entire time they were returning towards Earth, gravity was speeding them up more and more. So by the time they reached Earth, they were travelling almost 24,000 miles an hour. Now, I've seen a couple of people question how could the parachutes slow them down from that speed, and simply, they don't. There was around 13 minutes between them first reaching sort of the start of Earth's atmosphere and landing in the ocean. And the slowing down process goes through several steps. Now, I say they hit the start of Earth's atmosphere, but really there isn't a specific altitude where the Earth's atmosphere reaches to. Air just becomes gradually less and less dense the higher up you go. There's still odd particles of air way up beyond Earth. There's air particles up and around the altitude of the International Space Station, but they're so few that the amount of drag each one causes is next to nothing. But not nothing. Each particle does impart a small amount of drag onto the ISS, so over a period of time, they do cause a slight decrease in the ISS's orbit altitude. So every so often they have to perform an engine burn using one of the docked spacecraft in order to raise the station's altitude. But for spacecraft just passing through that altitude rather than orbiting around at it, the drag is imperceivable. However, as spacecraft get closer to Earth, the amount of air molecules increases and so too does the amount of drag they're producing. But gravity is still acting on the spacecraft, so until the amount of drag outweighs the acceleration due to gravity, their speed will continue to increase. And also, the faster you're travelling, the more air molecules you're hitting each second, so the more drag you experience. Much like putting your hand out of the window of a car that's travelling at 10 miles an hour versus doing it at 100 miles an hour. At 100 miles an hour, you're being hit by far more air molecules, so you're feeling more force on your arm trying to get dragged back. Eventually, they'll reach an altitude where the drag does outweigh gravity, and from here on, their speed begins dropping. So, let's look at the first post that tries to argue it's all a lie.
This is Artemis 2 coming back to Earth, and this is what NASA is showing us. They're showing us a bunch of people in an office, right? This is mission control. And first of all, the lighting is horrible here. And this is what we're getting. We're getting a CGI visualization of the re-entry, right? This is it right here, CGI. We're not getting any live footage. This is CGI.
So they find it strange that there's no live stream footage from Artemis during re-entry, and instead it's being replaced by an animation. Well, the first question to consider is what cameras would be live streaming it? The cameras that we'd been used to seeing from Artemis were GoPro cameras mounted at the ends of the solar panels, but the solar panels weren't attached to the Orion capsule itself, they were part of the service module behind Orion. The service module was jettisoned before re-entry because they needed to uncover Orion's heat shield because that is what would protect the crew coming through the atmosphere. Though we did actually get a live stream view as they approached re-entry from a camera located inside Orion looking out of the window. However, this then cuts out. Following which we see a camera filming Orion from the ground showing it re-entering, but it was very hard to keep it in view and eventually they lost it. So it then cuts away to a view of mission control and then brings up the animation for a period of time, and later the live feed then returns to view the capsule much closer to Earth and then showing the parachutes beginning to deploy. So, why the animation rather than an internal live stream? Well, building on what we've just gone over, it's quite interesting and rather important to note the drag that the spacecraft experiences on re-entry is not actually air molecules hitting the spacecraft itself. The spacecrafts are intentionally designed to not be streamlined on re-entry in order to generate more resistance. However, the thing is traveling so fast that when it first hits the atmosphere, the force is naturally pushing air molecules straight away from it very quickly. But those air molecules are then being pushed into more air molecules, and because the force of those initial ones being moved is so much, they'll force those other air molecules away too. So essentially you get this cushion of air surrounding the heat shield that is very quickly compressing the air in front of it. This sudden compression causes the air to get very hot very quickly. So hot in fact that it turns into this ionized plasma. And because of the slight curvature to the heat shield, this plasma wraps around the spacecraft. So it's not directly hitting it, but rather riding past it on a cushion of air. You can sort of see this idea yourself if you're on an aeroplane. Occasionally you'll see white streaks of condensation forming over the wing, but it's not directly hitting the wing. Instead, it's being pushed up and over the wing before it actually gets to the surface, and then it flows over it without actually touching it. So this stream of ionized plasma is wrapped right the way around the spacecraft, and it actually blocks signals being sent to and from the spacecraft. Now this is not new to Artemis. It is a standard communications blackout that all re-entering spacecraft experience, and it lasts a few minutes. We saw it through Apollo, we saw it through the space shuttle, we see it with SpaceX Dragon capsules returning from the ISS.
As we mentioned before, we have entered a communications blackout period, which lasts about 7 minutes due to the plasma formation on the exterior of the capsule. We've got about 5 minutes remaining until we believe we can acquire that signal again. Now, during this time, no vehicle telemetry is received by Mission Control or the recovery team, and no external commanding of the vehicle or voice communication is possible.
It was even famously portrayed in the movie Apollo 13.
Flight, we have lost of radio contact.
Roger that.
Expect to regain signal in 3 minutes.
And we do actually see this on NASA's own live stream for Artemis as well.
And as predicted, we've entered our communications blackout. This will be a 6-minute blackout period. No voice, no data from the crew.
Note the yellow glow appearing just before the camera cuts out. That's the plasma beginning to build up behind the spacecraft. So once it reaches a certain level, the signal to Orion is lost, and they not only lose the camera feed, but also the radio communications as well. So the NASA livestream now doesn't have a live feed directly from Artemis, and the ground camera is trying to film it, but is struggling to keep it in view, and eventually they lose sight of it. So they switch to a feed from Mission Control. I'm not entirely sure what his problem is with the lighting.
In an office, right? This is Mission Control. And first of all, the lighting is horrible here.
I think he overlooks this is basically an office space. It's for them to work. They need good amount of functional lighting to be able to see their workstations. They don't really need romantic mood lighting. But now we're just watching some people sitting at a desk. It's not exactly the most entertaining thing for the millions of viewers who are watching. So they switch to an animation to give something relatable to the audience to watch while they wait. They did the same thing during the Apollo moon landings. There was no TV camera feed during the landings because the TV camera was stowed in the descent stage to capture them coming down the ladder. And the camera that they did have recording the descent was a 16mm film camera, the footage of which couldn't actually be viewed and shared until the roll of film had been returned to Earth. But rather than show nothing during that period of time, the TV stations had already made basic animations in anticipation in order to give their audiences something to watch and to put the radio conversations into context.
160, 6.5 down, 5.5 down, 9 forward. Good. 20 feet.
Next, I saw this post from Jon Stewart, who states, quote, "You would travel 50 miles in 7 seconds at 25,000 miles an hour, so at 300,000 feet above the Earth, the capsule would have 7 seconds before it hit Earth. So it goes from 25,000 miles an hour to 350 miles an hour in less than 7 seconds." End quote. Which is fundamentally false. John's claim is based on the idea that the capsule is entering the atmosphere straight down, taking the most direct route to the ground, except they don't plummet straight down towards Earth. If they did, they'd be travelling so fast when they reach the thicker air closer to Earth that the temperature would increase way too much for the heat shield to cope with. Instead, they approach Earth at a shallow angle to increase the total distance travelled and thus allow more time for a gradual deceleration. Not only that, but as I've detailed in this previous video of mine, the spacecrafts are cleverly designed that they can actually generate lift, and they can roll the spacecraft to direct that lifting force. So they can have it lifting straight up above them to extend their path. They can roll 180 degrees in order to force a quicker descent to shorten their path, as well as rolling to the sides in order to control their direction. Artemis starts hitting the main bulk of Earth's atmosphere at around 400,000 feet, which is a point known as entry interface. This happened whilst they were near Hawaii, and eventually they splashed down off the coast of San Diego. So that's 2,000 miles they've travelled, not 300,000 feet. Hence, it took 13 minutes from entry interface to splashdown. Though I've seen many people claiming the capsule didn't return from space at all, but instead was dropped from the back of an aeroplane. Flat Earth Dave even posted a video claiming to show footage of this. Now, I do have to laugh at this one, because he shows footage of a command module during splashdown, then states, earlier that day, and then shows footage of a command module being dropped from the back of an aeroplane and claims it was one of the test runs. Except the splashdown footage he shows is from Apollo 15 returning to Earth in 1971. And the plane is a C-17 Globemaster, which didn't exist until 20 years afterwards. Certainly not earlier that day. This footage is of an Orion capsule being dropped from a plane. However, it's part of parachute tests that were done over several years from around 2008 to 2018. NASA obviously needed to ensure that the parachute systems would work correctly, but how do you test a parachute? Well, you put a dummy capsule on a plane, chuck it out the back and see if the parachute's open. And a good job they did, really, because in some of the early tests, the parachutes didn't work properly. So it's a good job that was a test vehicle, not an actual crewed flight. Now we come to the biggest claim that people have been talking about, which is the splashdown itself. Because the re-entry temperature is said to reach around 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit or 2,800 degrees Celsius. And people expect to see huge amounts of steam coming off the ocean when the capsule splashes down, because you have examples where red-hot pieces of metal are placed into water and the water boils. However, there are a few important factors to why this doesn't happen. In these examples, this is a big lump of raw metal, which is a very good conductor of heat, being heated thoroughly through, so there's a lot of energy stored within it, and then it's being dumped straight into water. Orion is very different. For starters, it's not a solid lump of metal. Orion consists of an inner pressure vessel, where the crew stay, but that's surrounded by a thermal protection layer. However, they leave lots of air gaps between the pressure vessel and the thermal protection in order to minimize how much energy can conduct through to the cabin, because pockets of air is a better insulator than having basically metal on metal. So much of the heat energy is actually kept on the outside of Orion, and even then, the main area that gets heated is the heat shield at the bottom. This is the part of Orion that reaches that peak 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Except the heat shield isn't metal. It's intentionally made as an insulator rather than a conductor, because the whole point of it is to keep the heat away from the crew compartment. The heat shield is made of an ablative material called avcoat. And ablative materials are ones designed to degrade and break away slowly on purpose. So as the heat builds up within the heat shield material, bits of it begin to break away. Those pieces that break away have already been superheated, so all that heat energy is instantly lost rather than being allowed to conduct through to the rest of the capsule. So the heat shield doesn't hold on to the heat energy in the same way that a lump of metal does. Then there's also the factor that the heating mainly occurs high up in the atmosphere during the blackout phase. So they're travelling still quite quickly through the upper air. Then the drogue chutes deploy at around 20,000 feet. That scrubs off a bit more speed. And then the main chutes deploy just below 10,000 feet to give them a slow, steady descent. But consider the air temperatures at those sorts of altitudes. At 10,000 feet, air temperature is already below freezing. And up and around 40,000 feet where planes fly, it's well below freezing up there. So that would draw heat energy away from that heat shield very quickly. So by the time the capsule reaches the ocean, the heat shield is no longer thousands of degrees. It's barely dozens of degrees. So heat energy will still depart into the ocean, but not enough to make the water boil and turn to steam. And finally, we have this image, which has been posted around a lot. Quite a few people questioning, how did the NASA logo survive the extreme heat of re-entry? The answer? It didn't, because that is not a photo of Orion, it's an AI render of it. Which actually then, ironically, makes this post by Jon Stewart accurate, because they're not the same craft. One actually exists, and the other is a work of fiction. This is a photo of Orion after splashdown, and you can see that this AI version has several inaccuracies. Firstly, where the NASA logo is claimed to be, there isn't any such logo, and instead it's where one of the windows is. Though here's a photo of Commander Reed Wiseman standing next to Orion after the recovery, and you can see that there was actually a NASA logo on the capsule, just not in the same place that the AI image suggests, except this NASA logo has been severely damaged by re-entry, like the conspiracy theorists expected. The crew hatch is missing off the right-hand side. So too are the thrusters around the base that are used to control the capsule during re-entry. There should be 5 helium bags on top, not 3, and being helium bags that are designed to help keep the capsule upright in rough waters, they should be tightly inflated, not sagging like this. And this is not the only AI image of Artemis that's being used to try and call the whole thing fake, but that's for another video. That's going to be it for this one. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.